Welcome to Is the FEC Ready for 2024? I'm Paul Smith, Senior Vice President of the Campaign Legal Center, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. CLC, Campaign Legal Center, is a national organization that works to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. We believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. The Federal Election Commission, the topic for today, or sometimes called the FEC, is responsible for enforcing the laws that govern the U.S. campaign finance system for campaigns for president and Congress. The FEC is the only federal agency whose sole responsibility is overseeing the integrity of our political campaigns. Unfortunately, the FEC has been mired in gridlock and dysfunction for over a decade, a situation that's allowed candidates from across the political spectrum to break the law with little recourse. The current structure of the FEC gives just a few commissioners the power to prevent the agency from acting on most major violations and issues that directly impact voters. Examples are super PAC coordination, the disclosure of secret money, disclosure of sources of funding for internet advertising, and many more. With those kinds of things, those kinds of concerns lingering, the question on the minds of many concerned with the state of our democracy is this: is the FEC ready for the 2024 election? So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over now to our moderator for today, CLC Legal Counsel for State and Local Campaign Finance, Aaron McKean, to introduce the members of today's panel.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm really excited to be the moderator today, in particular because I'm typically focused on state and local campaign finance reform, and the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis often want to know what's happening at the federal level, right? What does the FEC think about any particular issue that we're working on? So before we dive into that discussion, I do have some housekeeping items. I know you didn't expect a housekeeping discussion today, but we are going to make sure that we get your comments and questions in here. So during the conversation, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, please use the comment section to submit your questions for members of the panel. And then at the end of the panel, we'll start the question and answer section. We'll do our best to get to each question, but we have limited time today, so we may not be able to get to every question. And if we're not able to get to your question today and you're a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. And if you're a member of the public and we're not able to get to your question today, please email info@campaignlegal.org. With those housekeeping items out of the way, I would like to introduce today's panel. So we'll get started with Saurav Ghosh. Saurav is our Director for Federal Campaign Finance Reform at CLC, where he leads CLC's efforts to uncover campaign finance violations and file complaints seeking administrative enforcement, as well as pursuing legislative and regulatory reforms to strengthen and ensure the consistent and robust enforcement of federal campaign finance laws. Next, I would like to welcome Shanna Port, CLC's Senior Legal Counsel for Campaign Finance. Before joining CLC last year, Shanna was in private practice as a campaign finance attorney, advising clients on federal and state campaign finance laws and engaging in litigation on their behalf. And before that, Shanna was an attorney in the FEC's Enforcement Division, where she investigated complaints and advised the Commission on complex legal issues. And finally, we have Daniel Weiner. Dan serves as Director of the Brennan Center's Elections and Government Program, where he leads work on money in politics, voting and elections, government ethics, and other democracy and rule of law issues. He's authored a number of nationally recognized reports and law review articles on election law and related topics, and he's testified before Congress, state legislatures, and other governmental bodies, and regularly provides legal and policy advice to leaders in Washington and across the country. I'm excited to have this panel today. Thank you to the members for joining us. Well, I'm sure it will be a fascinating discussion that I in particular am looking forward to. Just to get started, I was hoping to start with Saurav, just to get some background on the FEC. I think I think it's easy for us to think of federal institutions like a federal commission as just this sort of monolith. But there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of people there. And I think it would be really great to hear about kind of what's that, history and purpose to help us kind of frame this discussion today.
Sure, thanks, Aaron. So I'll dovetail my comments with some of the things Paul said in his introduction. So the FEC is an independent regulatory agency that oversees and implements federal campaign finance laws. So these are the laws that apply to all of the candidates for both the House and the Senate, as well as the candidates for the presidency. And in addition, their laws apply to all of the PACs and super PACs, all of the registered political committees that are engaging in raising and spending money that goes towards influencing our federal elections. The FEC, as has been mentioned, is the only agency that has, the sole responsibility of maintaining the integrity of our elections. And so I think they play a really vital role in overseeing how folks are raising money, making sure the rules are followed in terms of how money is raised and how money is spent. And I think part of our discussion today is, the extent to which the FEC is being effective in that crucial mission. But just to give a little bit more table setting about the agency itself, some of its core functions that really matter a lot in a presidential election cycle like the one that we're in now. There is the Reports Analysis Division that basically reviews all of the disclosure reports that candidates and committees are filing, pointing out any irregularities or lack of information that needs to be provided. And then there's also an enforcement division. That's where, before joining CLC, where I worked and where Shanna also worked for a while. And that's the division that investigates alleged violations of campaign finance law and in appropriate cases enforces the law. And then you have other divisions like the policy division provides advice to the regulated community in the form of advisory opinions. These are basically where the FEC is asked a question about the legality of some proposed conduct and is able to provide an answer. And those answers are really important in terms of the regulated community deciding how to act, but also in shaping expectations about what the law can and can't do. They also implement regulations that provide more guidance to the community on what the law actually says. And so recently there was an update to their regulation regarding the digital disclosure of digital communications. So that's another really important function.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Saurav. I really appreciate having all that detail about kind of all the different divisions. There's a lot happening here in DC, but also across the country with all those elections. Dan, would you want to add on to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I have just tremendous respect for the work that the Campaign Legal Center does, and it's really just a joy to be here with you today. I think, that was a great summary. The only thing I would add that folks might sort of find interesting is the FEC is a very important and very unusual agency. And there are, maybe two features that Saurav, we might want to sort of underline for folks. One is, of course, the FEC is one of the only evenly divided multi-member federal agencies in Washington. So it's made up of, technically it's only 3 of the 6 commissioners can be members of any one political party. What that means in practice, and what it's always been, is that leaders in Congress and sometimes the White House, each, the 2 major parties each appoint half the commissioners. It's also one where the sort of career staff have less power than they do at many other federal agencies. Now, obviously, there's always a balance between political appointees and career, employees. But the commissioners at the FEC, who are again sort of evenly divided, have more control over the agency's day-to-day operations than exists at many other agencies. There are reasons that we can get into for why the agency was designed that way, but as we're going to talk about today, I mean, there are some real challenges that come with that structure too, and I think that are sort of interwoven in some of the issues that we're going to talk about.
Excellent. Thanks for adding that on, and maybe we can stick with you for a second just to kind of get to a little bit more, maybe like on the ground effect. What does it mean, to the average voter, right? When you're thinking about those structural issues, right? When you have an evenly divided commission, or you have commissioners who are much more active in the kind of day-to-day running of the agency, I think what we've seen here at CLC, and we're not shy about pointing out, is that the FEC, is, they're there to enforce the law, and we're expecting them to do that. Sometimes we think they don't actually do that quite as well as we'd like to. But, why does it matter to the average voter, that they're there to enforce the law, or maybe they're not quite enforcing the law like we think they should?
Well, no, that's a great question. And, Saurav and Shanna and other folks at CLC do really important work that I think does often sort of balance out some of the issues that we have with the FEC. So the stuff you do, and, that you've had a leadership role in, is really important. And I think it's important, for the average voter, right, for a couple of reasons. And I think you have to start with just the reality that overwhelming majorities of Americans want strong campaign finance laws, upwards of 70% in many of the surveys that I've seen. Strong rules on paper are nothing but that. They're paper, unless you have a body that is going to effectively administer and enforce them. That's how our government works. So without a strong, proactive FEC, you don't really get the benefit of whatever rules you do have on the books. And again, as I noted, Americans, say over and over again that they support these rules. What are some examples of that? Obviously, we limit campaign contributions. And if you don't have effective enforcement of campaign contributions, that can lead to major corruption, which is an issue that many Americans worry about. The state of Ohio right now has been engulfed in an enormous corruption scandal that is going to trial. That was a state issue, but it's a good illustration. And, the vector for that was a lightly regulated dark money group, right, that they funneled influence through. Transparency is also important for its own sake. You want to know who is trying to influence your vote. That is obviously harder if the agency in question, interprets transparency rules to allow groups with vague names like Americans for America to run ads, and you don't really know who's trying to influence you. Or allows people to pay, major influencers to hawk candidates, or it's not just a political issue. The FTC, our trade commission, deals with this too, and you don't actually know what the agenda is behind the messages that you're receiving. And lastly, I would say, another big aspect of American law in this area is that it defends U.S. sovereignty. Foreign governments, foreign oligarchs, foreign corporations are not supposed to be trying to influence U.S. voters. The FEC is the primary agency that is supposed to be protecting against that. And, if it doesn't do a good job, then U.S. sovereignty is potentially also compromised. So these are all reasons you should care about these issues. And the bottom line is that the rules on the books are only as good as the body that is enforcing them. And that's why we're here today.
Excellent. And I think that's a great opportunity to bring Shanna in here, because I want to hear more about why this matters to the average voter, right? I think Dan really did a great summary there of a number of issues where, folks might not be getting the information that they need, or they might not be getting the enforcement that we want to see. Can you talk a bit more about why that matters to folks on the ground? What does it matter to somebody in Ohio that there isn't so much enforcement?
Right. I think voters really want to see two things with campaign finance. And the first is they want to understand who's funding the campaigns and committees that they're hearing from, and who's sponsoring messages that they're getting on their TV and radio. And at the end of the day, they also want to know that the candidates that they're electing are going to be accountable to them rather than to big special interest groups. So I think Dan mentioned that the FEC has a major impact on election transparency. And I think that's absolutely right, in a place where voters see the real concrete results of the FEC's actions. On a very basic level, the FEC requires committees to disclose their donors on publicly available campaign finance reports. And people can look at those reports and try to get an understanding of who's funding the candidates they're voting for, which might give them a clue as to what policies those candidates would favor once they're in office. And I think the FEC does a good job of requiring reporting, but there are issues around the edges of that where true donors can be obscured. We mentioned dark money. We don't know the source of funding of dark money communications. And even with campaigns and committees that have stricter reporting requirements, there can be things like straw donor schemes where one person gives their money to an intermediary, the intermediary passes it on to the committee, and the committee gets to report the intermediary instead of the person the money actually came from. So without the FEC enforcing laws around straw donors and really investigating these issues, reports are of limited value if they're not reflecting the truth. I think at the start of an election cycle, we see candidates gearing up, and they have requirements about when they are supposed to register a committee and begin reporting. And we see candidates kind of skirting the limits there and delaying when they start reporting to the FEC. So there are gaps of times when voters don't even know who's financing their campaigns. And that has a real impact. I think another flip side of transparency is the disclaimer requirements. People want to be able to look at a message and know exactly who is sending it to them so they can immediately evaluate the credibility of it. I think Saurav alluded to earlier that the FEC recently addressed digital disclaimers on online ads. And I think we're, waiting to see how strictly the FEC enforces those rules. And then the last piece of this is really the accountability. When the FEC needs to strongly enforce contribution limits so that voters know that special interests aren't getting special access to candidates. And I think a big part of that too, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk more about super PACs, is making sure super PACs aren't coordinating with candidates, which deepens those connections to big money donors and makes voters question who candidates are listening to. So the FEC plays a big role in all of this and in kind of the general integrity of our election system. I think voters are very interested in how that plays out.
Fantastic. Thanks for that rundown. I was hoping, not to put you on the spot, but I was hoping you might give us an example of, someone kind of, running for office, but not making it clear that they're running for office or filing their reports, on time. What does that look like? Is there an example you could draw out for us?
Yeah, I think there are several examples from past election cycles. One big one that comes to mind is Jeb Bush. I think we saw in 2016 him traveling the country in conjunction with a super PAC, speaking to voters, raising money for his PAC, and spending money to campaign after the point where he had decided to become a candidate and hadn't registered yet. So technically under the FEC standards was a candidate, did not file that paperwork, so was not filing reports, and there were many attempts at enforcement actions against him over this conduct, but the FEC ultimately deadlocked on this issue and no enforcement action was taken. And we've seen that trend play out in election cycles since as well.
Yeah, and so maybe what we can take from that is that once folks do it and see that no one's getting penalized for it, or no one's being called out on it, officially, more folks are going to do it, right, going forward. And I think, that might be a good way to look ahead to the next topic I want to touch on, right, is this explosion in secret spending, this explosion in special interest spending over the past, say, 10 years, or basically since Citizens United. That is something where we've just seen more and more dark money or secret spending happening, where folks don't have to disclose their donors. I can say for sure, at the state and local level, we've seen an explosion of that in state and local races. But I would love to hear from you, Saurav, how the actions or the failures to act by the FEC played a role in this growth? And are there specific actions, by candidates and groups that folks should be keeping an eye on?
Sure. Well, as I think both Dan and Shanna have mentioned, transparency is a fundamental aspect of our campaign finance and election system. It's fundamental for voters to know, they have that right as participants in our democracy to know who's spending money to influence their vote, to get them to support this candidate or another. And that transparency is really fundamentally undermined if at the end of an ad, there's either no disclaimer, as was often the case for ads on digital media, or a disclaimer that provides the name of some obscure organization with an extremely generic name, like Americans for America is the canonical example. That doesn't provide the viewer with any sense of who's actually paying for that ad, and that's important if they're going to assess the credibility of that ad or the motivations of the group that paid for it. So I'll start with that. That's a really important value in our elections. And what we've seen over the past 10 years is a number of mechanisms that have been used, some of which should flatly be unlawful or are unlawful, but the law simply not being enforced as it needs to be. I think probably the two that I would highlight as the biggest vessels for money to secretly enter our political system would be the quote unquote dark money group, usually a 501c organization that under the tax laws, that election spending can't be their primary purpose, but we nevertheless see many of these 501c organizations raising and spending millions of dollars on elections, oftentimes running ads that explicitly say, vote for this person or don't vote for that person, what we lawyers call express advocacy. I think the FEC has repeatedly been asked or has had complaints alleging that some of these groups meet the legal standard for a political committee and therefore should be required to register as a political committee, which would require them to disclose their donors. As 501c organizations under current law, they're not required to disclose their donors. So, that's a big miss that the FEC has had a number of these cases and really hasn't enforced the law by finding these groups to be political committees and requiring them to report as political committees. That's information that voters have a right to know when a group like Americans for America forms and then spends millions of dollars either directly paying for ads or what we see more commonly in recent cycles, they will simply form a sister super PAC with an almost identical name and then just shift a huge amount of money to the super PAC. So yes, the super PAC is required to disclose its donors, but surprise, surprise, its donor is the C4 group that has the same name but doesn't disclose its donors. So it's really not transparency in any meaningful sense. That's a big problem that the FEC could resolve. And the other one is the straw donor scheme. This is a scheme in which a special interest group or even just one wealthy person will form a company. Oftentimes it's a limited liability company, but it really doesn't matter what exact vehicle it is. It's some kind of intermediary entity that they're using to make a contribution on their behalf. And that essentially defeats transparency, because when that contribution is disclosed, it's the name of the entity that's provided to the public and not the name of whoever was actually behind it and provided the money for that contribution. There have been a number of cases alleging that that violates the law, that is a contribution in the name of another, as the statute calls it. And for the most part, the FEC has not enforced the law. There have been some promising signs in some of the more recent cases, but I think by and large, there have been a number of cases where the FEC could have enforced the law and did not.
Aaron, do you mind if I give a little bit of, I want to just add on a little bit to what Saurav said. It might be helpful to put this in just a little historical context. So when, and we'll talk more about this, when Citizens United, the sort of somewhat notorious Supreme Court decision, was decided, many people thought that what would happen would be, Citizens United permitted corporations to spend directly on elections. People thought Coca-Cola would be like running political ads, trying to, persuade them. And one of the first things that people noticed is that didn't happen. Coca-Cola had no interest in directly running political ads. What Coca-Cola, and I'm using them as a generic example, did is give to what we've been calling dark money or secret money groups. And those groups ran political ads, and you had no idea what the interests were behind them. That was sort of phase one. That was, very much in 10 years ago, how dark money manifested in US elections. What we're seeing now, actually, and Saurav talked about this, is dark money essentially getting darker, right? So instead of running their own ads, these C4, C6 groups, which at least would need to, in some circumstances, have a disclaimer that says paid for by Americans for America or whatever, they are instead now funneling money to other organizations, like, as Saurav noted, super PACs, right? And then having a sort of a double layer, right? So a super PAC ostensibly discloses all its donors, but in reality, a lot of those donors are just opaque groups that you still can't know who's really behind them. That is one area. Another area, of course, is increasingly ads are moving online. The FEC, in a sort of promising step, has updated some of its online disclosure rules, but those are still very under-inclusive. And so you have a situation where even the ability to track dark money in a US elections is becoming much more difficult. And that poses a real challenge. I think, to be fair to the FEC, they can't deal with the entirety of that problem, but there's certainly more that they could do.
Thanks for adding that in. As I'm listening to you guys talk about this, it just sounds to me that it's essentially we're at a place where the campaign finance system, perhaps helped by the FEC's lack of enforcement, is maybe facilitating essentially a money laundering scheme for campaign money, right? People are able to pass money from one to the next, so you can't trace it, you can't find it, and that's a lot of what we see in other places, right? With money laundering, nobody knows where that money goes, and nobody necessarily knows where it comes from, and that's denying, at least in the election context, that's denying voters the information about who they might be supporting or not supporting.
Well, I do think you need to be careful. Yeah, I think that is, a really good way to put it in some circumstances. Obviously, sometimes the money laundering we're not talking about literally hiding illicit, illegal conduct, although sometimes we are. But in the very least, it certainly is denying voters the sort of ability to hold political actors accountable that, the Citizens United Court, and we'll talk about this in a minute, actually said was a bedrock of our system. Whether you call it money laundering or whether you call it just evading accountability, it's certainly a problem.
Excellent. Great. Thanks for adding that in. I think maybe there would be a good time to start. I guess we've talked about kind of, the Citizens United and a few other issues as we've gone on here. And I was curious, and maybe we can just stick with you, Dan, and then we can go around to each of you. I'd ask you to highlight, an action taken by the FEC over the past decade, which is a long time. It could be a decision or rulemaking or even a decision not to act that you think have missed the mark. Is there something that we can look for where the FEC has done something, failed to do something that you think has had pretty severe consequences, just to put some sort of meat on the bone here for folks as they're thinking about the practical effects?
Well, I would say that my biggest, concern, right, is that, we have had a series over the last decade plus of, major court cases that did, strike down significant chunks of U.S. campaign finance law. You would have hoped, though, that a regulator in that position would have responded to those decisions by trying to shore up the rules that are allowed and that, in fact, were integral to the Supreme Court's reasoning. So in Citizens United, the Supreme Court said that, outside groups, in Citizens United and subsequent lower court decisions, the court said outside groups can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money in federal elections, and by extension, state elections. That's what gave us super PACs, right, and dark money groups and the like. The FEC could have responded to that decision by saying, okay. The other aspect of it, though, was that the court really emphasized the importance of transparency. It was sort of this idea that these groups would be transparent. As we've already discussed, the FEC has not tried really particularly at all to ensure that the new sorts of spending enabled by Citizens United is transparent. And in fact, what I would view as gamesmanship over who has to register as a federal political committee, right, which is, sort of the most regulated type of entity, has made the transparency problem worse, as Saurav noted. They have a kind of, I know it when I see it test that, at least some of the commissioners consistently seem to apply to let people avoid registering unless they want to. The other big pillar of Citizens United was the idea that these new groups that they greenlit would be independent of candidates and parties. That was very important. It's the whole idea, and some folks may remember, is that independent spending doesn't corrupt. The FEC has, but independence is defined by legal rules. You can't talk to people. You're not supposed to have overlapping staff. Maybe you shouldn't be fundraising for a group that is supposedly independent of you if you are a candidate. The FEC's rules are already somewhat weak, but the FEC also just hasn't enforced them. I mean, I think, you could count on one hand the number of investigations of alleged coordination between outside groups and candidates or parties that they've actually investigated. And this is a pillar of the system that we supposedly have set up, right, is that these groups are supposed to be independent. And even the one area where the FEC does enforce, which is the prohibition against foreign national spending or foreign spending against foreign companies and oligarchs and governments, while they do enforce that somewhat more, they do so very slowly, and the penalties, are often, while they may be high on paper, they don't even account for the full amount that was actually donated by a foreign company. So in those instances, the FEC had a role in trying to, respond to the Supreme Court and shore up the aspects of our system that, the court has affirmed as constitutional, and the commission wasn't able to do that. And I do think that has been the proximate cause of some, not all, all, but some of the problems that we see that, the overwhelming majority of Americans are very angry about. And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for them, frankly.
Yeah, that really covers a number of issues where money is coming into our elections, and it's not just that we don't know where it's coming from; it's that it could be coming from places that that is it could be an illegal contribution, or it could be an illegal expenditure. And that I can really understand how transparency helps push that enforcement. Right? If we don't have that transparency, it's hard to be able to enforce those rules. And maybe we can turn to Shanna if you want to pick this one up in terms of a particular issue or a particular act or failure to act that the FEC has taken that you think is kind of sparked some consequences that you think are particularly important.
I think moving off what Dan said, and maybe top of mind because we're at the start of a new election cycle, which is where we see some of these problems, is concerns over soft money. And by soft money, I mean money that was raised or spent not in compliance with the FEC's rules about contribution limits and source restrictions and reporting requirements. And federal law contains rules that prohibit candidates from dealing in soft money, from raising it and spending it and transferring it. But I think we've seen a lot of gamesmanship that the FEC has not cracked down on, particularly at the beginning of campaigns. I mentioned earlier, as an example of someone who maybe had crossed the threshold to candidacy earlier than he let on, was Jeb Bush. And another part of that story is that before he formally declared his candidacy, he was showing up at a super PAC's events, helping the super PAC raise money, even sitting for interviews and footage that the super PAC could use in ads once he did formally launch his campaign. And the FEC deadlocked on the complaint there and said there was no soft money issues, didn't take enforcement action against him. And from there, we've seen, other politicians take similar plays. In the 2018 cycle, the following election cycle, Rick Scott was actually formally the chairman of a super PAC shortly before he declared his own candidacy and helped it to raise money. And that money was later spent on his election. Another twist we see on this kind of candidates interacting with soft money is candidates using state campaign committees or state PACs that they control to raise money. And they might be raising this money under state laws that are laxer than the FEC's laws and taking up corporate contributions in much larger quantities than the FEC would allow. And they'll back away from their state committee shortly before the state committee transfers all that money to a federal super PAC that goes on to spend on that candidate's race. We saw a complaint about this in 2020 over a congressional candidate, Byron Donalds, and the controlling bloc of the FEC said this was okay because Donalds was essentially smart enough to step back from his state PAC shortly before he made that transfer. So they said they couldn't trace it back to him as a federal candidate. There's a lot of speculation about DeSantis making a similar move with much, much more money out of his state PAC, transferring that to a super PAC if he gets involved. And that is likely to become an issue in front of the FEC. And we've seen Donald Trump do something similar with his leadership PAC. So this was actually a federal PAC. So the money he raised was in compliance with federal laws when it went into this PAC, but he has since transferred tens of millions of dollars of it to a super PAC that's planning to support him in the race. So as I said, these soft money rules are supposed to prevent candidates from transferring and controlling money outside of the limits. And certainly a multi-million-dollar contribution to a super PAC is outside of the standard limits you see for PACs. So there's a complaint about that activity as well. And I think that poses, the core question we're here for is the FEC ready for 2024? And it's going to be put to the test with some of these issues that are already popping up as people launch campaigns in earnest.
Excellent. And then, thanks for adding that in. I do want to give Saurav a chance to weigh in on any particular FEC action or inaction, and then just being mindful of the time, and we'll take one more question for our panel, and then we'll probably turn it to our Q&A for the audience.
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief. I know we're running late. So we talked quite a bit about coordination and this idea of independence, and I think one thing that might be interesting to people is why does it matter? The idea of campaign finance law is that we're trying to prevent corruption, right? Which is a major concern if a special interest like a wealthy donor or a corporation can simply write a large check to a candidate, and the kind of relationship that creates is clearly not ideal for our political system. The problem with coordination is that it effectively creates the same kind of relationship because, since Citizens United, these wealthy donors and corporations have been able to write checks as large as they like to a super PAC. And we've seen many super PACs that have been formed have done so solely to support a single candidate. So when you have a situation where a single candidate super PAC can take unlimited amounts of money as well as corporate money and back that candidate, the real concern is that coordination then allows that super PAC to not only to not independently support the candidate, but really to become an arm of the campaign. So the question was, is there an FEC decision that kind of went the wrong way? I was thinking about this, and the case that came to mind was a case called Vote Vets, in which the FEC made a statement in response to a complaint alleging coordination between Pete Buttigieg's campaign and a super PAC that was supporting him, and basically said that the support was coming, was not coordinated because the only communication that the complaint pointed to from a member of the campaign asking for specific kinds of ads, the only communication like that was a tweet. And the commission has previously said and really doubled down on this statement in the Vote Vets decision that these kinds of public statements are not covered by the coordination test. That if it's said, not to a specific a request for a specific audience, but a statement made to the general public, that's not the kind of activity that forms coordination that's covered by the law. I think the real problem there is that we live in an internet age. These coordination rules are quite old at this point. Every campaign has a website. The parties maintain their websites, tweets, all kinds of ways to publicly communicate. It's in general, it's a public facing message, but the content of that message can really be fashioned for a very specific audience. So there's this problem where it's this concept called redboxing, where candidates and party committees post instructions that are not intended for the general public, but are actually intended for a very specific audience, the super PACs that are preparing to spend millions and even hundreds of millions of dollars to back the candidates and do so with the specific messages that the candidates have requested. I think by any common sense definition, that's coordination. I think if you ask anyone, is that coordinated activity? If someone posts a message saying, voters in Akron over the age of 50 who work blue collar jobs, or as specific as you want to get, need to read that so-and-so candidate has been endorsed by all these labor organizations. That's a very specific ask that if a super PAC then takes that baton and runs millions of dollars of ads, that super PAC is functionally part of that campaign at that point, creating the very corruption concerns that the campaign finance law is trying to avoid. I think that's a big problem and a real swing and a miss for the FEC.
Thanks for that example, Saurav. And at the risk of doing too much self-promotion, I would just remind folks that if you like these virtual events, you can check one out on Redboxing, which is exactly what Saurav was just talking about. We put one together a few weeks ago, going in depth into that Redboxing problem, because it's an issue at the federal level, and it's also an issue at the state and local level. And so it's really spanning, campaign finance across the board. Definitely an emerging issue that we want to deal with. Just looking at the time, I do want to make sure we get to some audience questions. Although I will say it, we've been talking about a lot of problems, and I also want to hear about solutions. If there are legislative solutions out there that have really caught your attention, or that you think would really make a difference here, I'd love to hear about them right before we get into questions from the audience. And maybe Shanna, if you have something to start with, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I can offer something a little more upbeat. One thing that has definitely caught my eye is last legislative session, part of the For the People Act was a reform aimed at allowing for greater enforcement of these problems we've heard about. As we've said, the FEC is kind of unique because it's evenly divided, typically between 3 Democratic commissioners, 3 Republican commissioners. And for the commission to move forward with an action, it requires 4 votes under the current regime, which means that 3 commissioners, not a majority of the commission, can block any enforcement action. And what the reform is in the For the People Act is to give the staff more power. Allow the staff to present a recommendation to the commission and then say that that becomes the decision of the commission unless the commission vetoes it with 4 votes. So it completely flips this presumption on its head that, the tie goes to non-enforcement under the current system. With this reform, the tie would go to enforcement, if that is what the Office of General Counsel recommends. And the proposal does a similar thing with investigations. Currently, the commission needs to authorize subpoenas to go out, any sort of discovery when you're trying to build a case against someone. This bill would, again, put that decision in the hands of the staff. They'd say, hey, we're going to send out the subpoena, and if the commission didn't veto it by a majority vote, that subpoena goes out the door. So this would really be a big flip in how the FEC functions. And I think, judging by the number of times the staff recommends moving forward with the case, and it's the commission that ties on that so nothing happens, we would see much more enforcement.
Sorry, just wanted to make sure, Dan, I wanted to bring you in on that as well, if you want to follow up there.
Sure. I think that is an important reform. It was in the For the People Act, which was a sort of big democracy reform bill that passed the U.S. House of Representatives several times. It was also in the Freedom to Vote Act, which is a sort of modified law, has fewer provisions than the For the People Act, but that also came very close to passing in the Senate in the last Congress, and has become, I think, in many respects, along with the Voting Rights Act, sort of flagship democracy reform bill, at least for Senate Democrats. And I do agree with Shanna that is a really important reform. And I think maybe it's important to understand that that is how most federal agencies operate, right? Is that the career staff often, will usually make determinations around, initial investigations and the like, subject to a veto by political appointees, up to and including maybe a majority of a commission. But it is not normal, and it is not usually the case that political appointees, need to affirmatively allow them to even start an investigation. And I think that is an imbalance that is part of why the FEC suffers from some of the enforcement challenges. And that sort of reform actually has bipartisan support in the House. House that has been included in various bills that did get both Democratic and Republican support. I will add, one other thing, and it's not legislative. I do think that the current commissioners at the FEC have shown some increased willingness to come together on some reforms. And so I am cautiously hopeful that they might also, of their own accord, vote to make some improvements. I was at a hearing yesterday on an interesting issue that there did seem to potentially be some cross-partisan agreement. I do think ultimately the reforms to the enforcement process are probably, are very important. They're going to have to come from Congress.
Excellent. I think just to make sure we get to some questions from our audience, I think it'd probably be about time for that. The first question that we have is from Nancy Morgan. If an official has a PAC but isn't running yet, like Glenn Youngkin, does he have to report donations, including in-kind donations? If he isn't a candidate but issues a promotional ad, is it a campaign or issue ad? Why don't we start there with Shanna, if you want to take that one first?
There is an allowance under the law for candidates to form a committee to test the waters, to try to figure out if they are a viable candidate and want to launch a formal campaign for federal office. At that stage, when the candidate's testing the waters, they don't have to report the donations to that committee yet. But as soon as they trigger candidacy on their first report, they do need to go back and disclose all of those contributions. So hopefully we will eventually see who's funding a situation like this where an official isn't yet running, but is engaging in some activity. And then I think it's also a very fact-specific issue. If the candidate is releasing a promotional ad, we've talked some about soft money, and I think sometimes we'll see a candidate who has a state PAC using their state PAC to kind of promote their name ahead of a federal launch. And there are rules prohibiting candidates from using a state PAC in this way. So that's one way the law might be broken if we're talking about promotional ads.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think one of the issues that we document and highlight quite a bit in our campaign finance work is the abuse of those testing the waters rules. I don't know the situation with Governor Youngkin, but many folks who are contemplating a run for the presidency, for example, often use an existing PAC, like maybe they have a leadership PAC, which is supposed to be for supporting fellow travelers of the same party. They will often use it to finance a lot of their testing the waters activity, while effectively denying that that's what they're doing. And so, that's a way for them to avoid disclosing what they've raised and spent to explore candidacy, even after they've become a candidate.
Great. Yeah, and that really does kind of demonstrate that balance that we're trying to strike. We do want people to run for office, right? We want them to be able to do that, but we also need voters to know where the money is coming from, who's supporting them when they're doing that, and that can be a tough issue. I think if we have another question, this would be a great time for it, and we've got one from Barbara Palmer. What are your thoughts about the use of 501c3 organizations to fund election offices like equipment and staff, training, and the FEC's responsibilities to monitor these activities? Yeah, Dan, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. Well, a couple thoughts on that. So the FEC would not have jurisdiction in most instances over that, in part because elections are administered at the state level. And so they, are that's just not really what the FEC oversees. I will say, the best way, if you're disturbed by or uncomfortable with private donations to election offices, which were necessary in at least 2020 when we were sort of faced with a crisis with conducting an election in a pandemic, is to make sure that there's sort of adequate funding, public funding for elections. I think that elections are a government function, and I think it's ideal that they be publicly funded. The election administration be publicly funded, but we have a sustained funding crisis with elections, and then in certain circumstances, outside organizations have stepped in. I think you need to be very careful in those circumstances. It needs to be nonpartisan. It needs to be subject to checks. It's not something one would ever do lightly. But again, at the Brennan Center, we've done a lot of work on this issue, and our bottom line is sustainable funding, public funding for election administration is the best solution.
Thanks for that. And I think that that's a helpful clarification, right? Because I think what Barbara's talking about is, how are you actually running that election, making sure that voters, have their ballots and making sure that the machines are working. And that's going to be a separate, function from what the FEC is doing.
Well, and it's one thing we sort of assume, but it's probably worth making explicit. So in most countries or in many other democracies, there is a central election body that runs elections. That's not how we do things in the United States. States and localities run all elections, including federal elections. So we do not have a central election administrator the way they do, say, in France. And sometimes people think that's the FEC because they have election in their name, but that they really are limited just to campaign finance.
But let me add just one quick point, because it's what occurred to me when seeing this question. When we're talking about 501c3s, we're talking about charitable organizations. And there's a really important distinction between these kinds of groups and the 501c4s and c6s that we were talking about earlier. C3 charitable groups aren't allowed to engage in any electoral advocacy. So if that's what's happening under the guise of these nonpartisan election financing efforts, then that's an issue. It would be an issue for the IRS to handle, and there's a whole separate conversation about the lack of IRS enforcement. But that is an important distinction that these are a different kind of organization.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification. I think we're going to turn to one more question that I have here, which is, there's a provision in FECA, in the federal election, in federal election law that allows citizens to proceed with the enforcement of laws, but when the FEC sort of refuses to take action, right? Why are those being blocked, or are those being blocked? And is there something that the public can do to ensure that the FEC is doing its job? And maybe we can start there with Saurav, if you want to take that to start.
Sure. So there is this provision that allows for private rights of action when the FEC fails to act, and CLC actually was a litigant in a number of those actions by bringing those cases. To the extent the question is, why is the FEC blocking that now? As just a procedural matter, what's happening is that the FEC is acting, but they're acting in a way that declines to enforce the law, and thus effectively forecloses those enforcement private right of action suits. So why that's happening has to do with the makeup of the commission and kind of what they're choosing to do with the complaints that are before them. But I think the problem, of course, is one way or the other, campaign finance laws need to be enforced so that they can be more than just rules written on paper, so that they can actually shape the actions of candidates and committees to follow the rules. So unfortunately, what's happening now is that we're back to the situation we once were, where the FEC's failure to act is not being challenged in court. And unfortunately, I'm not sure, maybe others have thoughts on this. I'm not sure there's much that the public can do to change that other than, joining in efforts to advocate for more structural reforms at the FEC, like the one Shanna pointed out, changing the sort of the 4-vote requirement to investigate something to a 4-vote veto, or perhaps an even more drastic change like changing the very structure of the commission, which is something that's also been proposed in some of the more ambitious legislative actions that have been considered.
And I think there are some legislative provisions out there dealing with making these cases a little easier to bring. Usually these come about because the FEC doesn't act on a complaint. The complainant has to sue the FEC. A court has to decide the FEC messed up and send it back to the FEC. And then the FEC, again, if it fails to take action, then a private person can sue the person they complained against, which is the citizen suits we're talking about. And that first step of getting a court to say the FEC got it wrong is a difficult step in itself, because under current court precedent, the FEC gets a lot of deference. But there has been some legislation to try to change the judicial standard there and make it easier to send a case back to the FEC. And similarly, there have been some legislative proposals trying to allow for court review even when the FEC kind of cites to its prosecutorial discretion as a get out of jail free card. So I think in terms of what the public can do is advocate around these reforms and continue pressing for this among the other structural changes that Saurav noted.
Excellent. And, I think with that all in mind about kind of looking ahead to what we might hope for the FEC and maybe changes there, that might be a good place for us to wrap up as we're looking at the time here. And I'd love to give kind of each of our speakers one more chance to just kind of give us some final thoughts as we're looking ahead, to 2024, certainly, and any changes that we might expect or things that we're keeping an eye on. And I'd like to start, maybe we'll start with Dan.
Sure. Well, this has been a real pleasure and a very thought-provoking conversation. I guess I'd leave with maybe two thoughts. So first of all, going back to where we started, in generally in this field, it's a truism that unenforced rules can be worse than having no rules at all, because it leads to a culture of impunity. We've made it through this entire event without discussing a certain congressman from Long Island, Representative Santos, which is actually impressive. But, one thing that I have wondered about that is whether the sort of Wild West campaign finance environment that we have, at least in certain areas, might have led some people to assume that there just were no rules that are really enforced. And the end result is, right, even many of the people who might have supported him, are very upset about the alleged conduct that he's engaged in. The second thing, and related, is I do think in all of these discussions, it is important to remember that, the FEC does have a hard job. It regulates an area of public life that is very important, where we've concluded that there need to be rules, but at the same time, there are important liberty interests at stake. So I think what is important to remember is no one at this event, or I think anyone in this field, thinks that what the FEC does is straightforward or that there aren't hard questions. But what the FEC will need to do, certainly ahead of 2024, and what our hope is that the FEC can be better at wrestling with these hard questions. And as I said, coming, not just wrestling, but also coming to some resolution that the public, the so-called regulating community, and others can rely on. And I think that there's been some indication that they might be, getting a little bit better on that front, but there's still a long, long way to go. And this is going to continue to be an issue in American elections, particularly as sort of spending skyrockets. So I went over time, but again, thank you for having me. And it was a really wonderful discussion.
Yeah, it's been great having you here, Dan. And I did have George Santos's name written down here, but I think maybe our conversation today illustrates that these issues are bigger than any one candidate.
Very much so.
These issues are big across the country, and his candidacy is kind of an example of all the ways it can go wrong. And so maybe we can turn then to Saurav.
Sure. I mean, thank you guys for having me on this panel. I agree. This is a really interesting conversation. I'll echo Dan's point that the FEC has a tough job. It was a job I helped to do for a number of years. These aren't simple or straightforward questions, but I think at the same time, we deserve and voters deserve to have a campaign finance system that effectively creates the transparency they need to participate in the political process and to prevent the corruption that is really flourishing under the current state of affairs. So I'll take the other tack and say that I think the FEC should be held to a really high standard because these are really important issues. So it's always disappointing to see these cases that deadlock. And again, I'm biased as a former member of the staff, but I think their campaign finance staffers are extraordinary professionals and should be given a lot more leeway to help resolve these issues and not see so much of their work kind of hit a brick wall at the commission level. I think they care a lot about these issues, and they more often than not have the right idea about what deserves investigating, at least to give the public a better sense of whether someone violated the law. So that's my hope for the future and for this election cycle and ones to come.
Awesome, thanks. And I think that does really demonstrate the balance that we're trying to strike here, right? You can't ask someone to do the impossible, but at the same time, there are things that are certainly possible that I think most folks would find pretty reasonable that we're asking of the FEC here. And then why don't we give the last word to Shanna?
Well, thanks for having me. It's been really nice to talk about these topics, and obviously we could talk all day. I don't think I have too much to add. Dan and Saurav definitely captured my sentiments as well. And I think, like Dan was saying, the commission does seem to be picking up. There was a period for a while where the commission lacked quorum and couldn't get anything done. And I think we saw a backlog develop in that time. And now, particularly in the rulemaking space, we're seeing the commission take on some of these tough questions, like with its finally closing a decade-long saga over digital ad rules. We just had a hearing yesterday about salary payments for candidates. So I think it is really heartening that we're making progress on some of these unresolved issues, and hopefully we resolve them in the right way. And we just have greater clarity on a lot of these areas in our campaign finance system and make it easier for candidates to comply.
Amen.
We're finishing on a lot of hope here, which feels pretty good. I do want to thank all of our panelists for being here, for Paul with the introduction today, and for this conversation. It's been really helpful for me as well. Thinking about these issues. We see them at the federal level, and inevitably things that happen at the federal level happen at the state and local level, and that's how a lot of my work kind of moves. And so it's really helpful to be able to hear all these issues and think about them deeper. So I do want to end with a big thanks to all of our panelists, and as we're looking ahead to 2024, I think we all agree here that we need a strong FEC to enforce federal campaign finance laws and hold candidates, parties, PACs, all their donors accountable, so that we do have a democracy that's more representative, that's more accountable to the people. So as we look to 2024, again, we at Campaign Legal Center certainly will look to hold the FEC accountable and do everything we can to ensure the law is enforced. And I'm sure Dan would happily join in on that as well. If you have additional questions or would like more information, please email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.